Welcome! You're listening to the Uncharted Lancaster podcast, where we explore the hidden histories, forgotten places, and long-buried secrets of Lancaster County. Using modern digital storytelling tools, each episode brings a new piece of local lore to life, revealing the strange, the surprising, and the stories history left behind. Let's begin.
Okay, let's just jump right in. We often think about power generation as, this very clean, very controlled process, or maybe a huge mining operation divvying for some pristine resource.
Mm-hmm.
But I want you to picture something completely different. I want you to imagine a massive, multi-million-dollar industry that was built entirely on scraping the bottom of a major U.S. river for literal trash.
And not just doing it, but doing it so successfully that it powered, and I'm quoting here, a goodly chunk of the metropolitan East for decades.
It's an incredible image.
It really is. It sort of defies our modern ideas about resource management. You have this dirty industrial fleet, they even called it the hard coal navy at one point, working just miles from where people are fishing and boating.
Right, with bald eagles flying overhead.
Exactly. And yet the product of this fleet, this fine black coal silt, was absolutely critical to the regional power grid.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, we are going into the incredible, and I think mostly forgotten, history of what was known as river coal dredging.
And we're focusing specifically on the Susquehanna River in Pennsylvania, around the Holtwood and Safe Harbor dams, an operation that ran from, the late 1800s all the way up to 1972.
Yeah, and at its heart, this is a story of incredible engineering ingenuity that was born directly out of a catastrophic industrial failure happening just upstream.
To help us unpack all this, we've got a really fascinating stack of sources. There's a 1948 pamphlet called Scraping the Bottom, which is just amazing.
That's a great title.
It is. We also have historical visitor guides from the power company itself and some really detailed articles from railroad societies that get into the nitty-gritty of the logistics.
And our mission here really is to understand how these engineers at the Pennsylvania Water and Power Company took what was, let's be honest, a massive environmental crisis.
Oh, absolutely. Hundreds of millions of tons of coal waste choking the river.
And they transformed it into this sophisticated, highly profitable, and surprisingly long-lasting power solution.
The geography here is it's the key to the whole story. The sources describe the Susquehanna River as, quote, fighting its way over three huge dams, Holtwood, Conowingo, and Safe Harbor.
And these dams, built for clean hydroelectric power, they accidentally became the world's most effective sediment traps.
Which brings us to Holtwood. Holtwood is really the star of this whole narrative. It has this unique historical distinction.
What's that?
It was the site of the only known combined operation in the world that was simultaneously harnessing river water for hydroelectric power and using fuel dredged right from that same river's bottom to fire a colossal steam plant.
Wait, so the same river was providing both the falling water for the turbines and the fuel to make steam for other turbines right next door?
Yes. A single river providing both the mechanical energy and the chemical energy. It's just an astonishing piece of adaptive engineering.
They literally found a way to make the river pay for the pollution it was carrying. But like you said, this whole thing was only possible because of the massive failure of the coal industry upstream.
Yeah.
Before we can even talk about the black gold they found in the sediment, we have to understand the sheer scale of the waste that created it.
To really get why all this coal was just sitting on the riverbed, we have to go back, a century to the anthracite mining regions. Anthracite hard coal. It's different from the softer bituminous coal.
It's not a bulk commodity.
It's not. It has to be extremely pure, free of impurities, and it has to be broken down into very specific uniform sizes before you can sell it.
Which means if the coal was mixed with rock or slate, or if it was the wrong size, especially if it was too small, it was basically worthless on the market at the time.
And just tossed aside, the early processing methods were, they were stunningly primitive. From about 1825 up to the late 1800s, the industry used what they called the dry method.
Okay.
So the coal comes up from the ground. They call it run-of-mine coal. It goes through roller crushers, and then it's sent on conveyor belts past workers known as breakers.
And these were men and often very young boys who had to manually pick out the pieces of rock and slate.
Yes, and we have to pause there because that was just grueling, dangerous labor. These were the infamous breaker boys working these incredibly long shifts in the dark and the dust for pennies.
A huge human cost, just baked into this story from the very beginning.
It really is. And because those conveyor belts never stopped moving, the workers, whether they were boys or men, they had very little time to look at each piece.
So if a piece was questionable, like a mix of coal and rock,
they just threw it out. It would take too long to separate. It was discarded into these massive waste piles. The priority was speed, not efficiency.
and on top of that, the industry had no use for the really small pulverized sizes of coal, the stuff they called fines,
Right. So even pure coal, if it was too small, got dumped too.
which meant these waste piles, the culm banks as they were called, must have been enormous.
They were colossal. And the sources point out that some of these banks ended up containing as much as 50% actual usable coal.
50%. That's not a waste pile, that's a fuel reserve.
They were untapped mountains of fuel. It's an almost unbelievable level of waste.
Staggering.
Truly. A study from 1928 by Sisler and his colleagues, they looked back at that whole period from 1825 to 1900 and concluded that a large portion of all the coal that was mined,
A third, maybe more.
potentially a third or more, was just lost, discarded into these banks simply because the dry method was so bad at separation. The whole landscape was just dominated by these black, smoking mountains of discarded wealth.
But then, right around the turn of the century, technology finally caught up. The shift to a wet process must have seemed like a miracle.
Oh, it absolutely did. Around 1890, they introduced the wet process, and it relies on a really basic principle of physics, specific gravity.
Right, coal is lighter than rock.
Exactly. Coal floats, rock and slate sinks. So you mix the material with water in these big structures they called washeries, and the separation happens almost automatically.
So this meant they could go back to those decades-old culm banks, those black mountains, and remine them.
That's exactly what they did. These washeries were built specifically to reprocess the old banks. It was a huge economic success. It created more business for the railroads, for industry. Some of these operations were pulling 500,000 tons of salvaged coal a year out of the old waste piles.
It was one of the first big industrial recycling efforts in the region.
It was.
So great, they're saving the coal on land, but that success created the second and much bigger environmental problem, the liquid pollution.
That's the central tragedy here, because when they used this wet process, the discharge water, the breaker water, was just black with huge amounts of fine coal particles or silt, along with all this highly acidic mine drainage.
And environmental standards back then were non-existent.
Non-existent. So this thick, black, acidic liquid was just dumped directly into the nearest streams and tributaries.
And the ecological devastation was immediate, I assume.
The sources paint a grim picture. It killed all the fish, all the aquatic life right away. It poisoned the vegetation along the streams. And because it was so fine and dense, it started to build up in the stream beds and caused all this backflooding.
Oh,
So when the streams overflowed, they would spread these immense sheets of silt coal over adjoining meadowlands, which permanently destroyed the farmland.
the rivers just became the new dumping ground.
The whole system of streams that fed the Susquehanna was transformed into a giant rain gutter, just collecting all these coal particles and slowly pushing them downstream.
The scale is just hard to comprehend.
It is. Experts who studied the region estimated that there had accumulated in the streams and rivers at least 900 million tons of material that was profitable enough for future recovery.
900 million tons. Let's try to put that in perspective for you. A standard railroad hopper car holds about 100 tons. So you're talking about 9 million full train cars of coal silt just sitting on the bottom of the state's waterways.
It's just an incredible, unsustainable loss rate. They calculated that the loss of fine coal in the wastewater alone was 2.7% of the total amount of coal shipped from the Western Middlefield.
So this wasn't a one-time spill. This was a continuous disaster building up over 80 years.
And this enormous, free, constantly replenished stockpile of fuel was just sitting there, waiting for the right geographical feature to trap it.
Which brings us directly to the Holtwood Dam. When they finished it in 1910, creating the 8-mile-long Lake Aldred, they had no idea they'd just built the perfect industrial asset.
They had created a completely accidental 8-mile-long settling pond.
Right, as the fast-moving river carrying all that fine black sediment hit the still water behind the dam.
The laws of physics just take over. All that pulverized coal settled out, and it transformed the river bottom into this deep, black carpet of industrial waste.
It must have been an incredible aha moment for the engineers. They're sitting on a colossal fuel source that's being delivered to their doorstep, free of charge.
It was the ultimate resource recovery project. They realized they had this free, constant fuel supply, but first, they needed to know where the thickest deposits were.
So they had to map it. How do
Yeah.
you map the bottom of a huge lake without modern sonar?
The old-fashioned way. They started with aerial photos and intense shoreline studies to see how eddies and floods created patterns. Then they set up fixed survey points along the shore, which they called stimes.
Stimes, I love that, like a fixed observation point.
Exactly. And from these stimes, they'd work their way across the water, taking test borings every few feet, sampling the bottom every 2 feet of depth.
So they were building a 3D map of trash, basically.
A three-dimensional map of trash, exactly. And the map showed these fascinating patterns based on the river's hydrodynamics.
It wasn't just uniform sludge.
No, they found stratification alternating layers of coal, then sand, then coal again, which was a direct result of the high water periods, the freshets, that would wash heavier sand over the settled coal.
So they knew exactly where to dredge.
They knew exactly where to focus. They found a skim of anthracite on the outside of river bends, but the thickest deposits were where the strong currents met the quiet main body of the lake.
Once they knew where it was, recovery became an economic imperative. The Pennsylvania Water and Power Company had built its steam generator station at Holtwood in 1925.
Mm-hmm.
And at first, they were just buying commercial coal, like any other power plant.
But you can just imagine the internal reports. We're paying for coal while we're sitting on millions of tons of free fuel right outside. The transition was quick. By 1937, the plant was running entirely on what they could glean from the riverbed.
And let's talk about the economics here, because this is where the genius of it really shines. That steam plant, using this scavenged fuel, it increased the total electric output of the entire Holtwood development.
Which already included the massive hydroelectric dam.
By close to 25%.
A quarter increase in power output, supplied entirely by waste. By the time that 1948 pamphlet was written, they'd already pulled 2 million tons of anthracite out of the river.
And the savings were huge. In 1948, regular commercial coal delivered to a plant in the region cost over $8 a ton.
But the riverbed coal, they were salvaging it, dredging it, and fully processing it for less than $3 a ton.
That's a saving of over $5 per ton. Multiplied by hundreds of thousands of tons a year, you're talking millions of dollars.
And this made power cheaper for the whole region. Because the plants had figured out how to burn these super fine sizes of coal, the stuff that was waste 40 years before large industrial users could see their fuel costs drop by as much as a third.
So this wasn't just some clever trick. It was a cornerstone of regional industrial competitiveness.
Absolutely. And those economics are what drove the scale of the operation to industrial levels, which brings us to the hard coal navy.
Okay, let's get out on the river and picture this fleet. It all starts miles upstream from the dam where you have a string of dredges.
Steam-powered, bucket ladder, clamshell types.
Constantly working in water that's anywhere from 15 to 50 feet deep.
This was a serious, full-time operation. Dredging had been happening sporadically since the 1880s, but under PWMP, it became centralized and massive.
The wartime production numbers are incredible. During World War I, when coal was tight,
They went into overdrive.
in 1918 and 1919 alone, they hauled 750,000 tons out of the river.
It's an enormous amount. And the techniques got more efficient over time, too. Early on, they used suction hoses or drag lines from the riverbanks. But down by the dams, where the silt was deep and fine, they shifted to rotary pump suctioning.
So once the dredges pulled up this raw material, this dripping mix of sand, mud, water, and coal, they had to move it.
Right. They piled it onto these flat wooden barges. The fleet had about 30 barges in total. Most were small 20-tonners, but the pride of the fleet were 2 massive 500-ton barges.
The waddlers.
The waddlers. It's such a great nickname. It gives you this perfect image of these heavy, clumsy crafts sitting low in the water.
And loading them was a slow process.
Very slow. It could take 5 or 6 hours of continuous dredging to fill one of the 500-ton waddlers.
Once they were loaded, they had to be moved by these specialized river tugs.
And these weren't modern diesel boats. These were steam tugs with these iconic twin paddle wheels at the stern. A pair of tugs would lash 12, maybe 14 barges together and shepherd them downstream to the plant at Holtwood.
That sounds like a tough job.
The sources say in rough weather, it required serious seamanship. You're dealing with heavy payloads and strong currents. But the contrast was amazing. On calm days, the crews would report watching bald eagles and deer along the shores.
This incredible mix of heavy industry and natural beauty.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of natural phenomena, we have to talk about the ice. It's such a bizarre little anecdote.
Yes, the discovery in August of 1926. A dredge operator named David Rankins is working in 100-degree summer heat.
In August.
And his dredge snags 4 large chunks of ice, averaging 5 feet in length from the bottom of the river.
Ice. In August. How is that even possible?
Well, the theory they came up with is just a brilliant piece of practical river physics. They figured the spring ice flows were driven by the current deep under rock formations on the riverbed.
Okay.
Then the coal-laden river sand, that black silt they were dredging, washed over the ice and formed a thick crust.
So the pollution acted as insulation.
Perfect insulation. The very material they were dredging was acting like a natural refrigeration system, preserving a piece of winter right through the summer.
That's incredible. But once those tugs got the barges to the docks at Holtwood, the really complex part of the operation began, turning that muddy slurry into pure power plant-ready coal.
This is where the innovation becomes mechanical and chemical. At the Holtwood dock, a huge clamshell bucket would unload the silt into these gaping bunkers near the processing area, which they called the table plant.
And that raw material was what, maybe half coal?
Up to half coal. So a 500-ton waddler is delivering 250 tons of fuel mixed with 250 tons of sand and mud.
And the first step to separate that was the table plant. And the technology here was borrowed from a completely different industry.
From gold miners, yeah. They adapted the shaking table. Each table was made of wood and steel with a rubber-covered deck that had these little ridges or riffles.
And the whole thing would just jiggle back and forth.
It would jiggle horizontally, vibrating constantly while being washed by a surge of water.
So it's that same specific gravity principle again?
Exactly. The lighter coal bits would float off over the riffles to one side, while the heavier sand would sink and get flushed into a drain pipe.
A simple, high-throughput method?
For the coarser particles, yes. The result was this oozy, wet coal that went up a conveyor belt to drain. But the shaking tables were only good for, beach sand-size coal.
Right. What about the really fine stuff, the dust that was really clogging the river?
For the finest river-bottom silt, the tables were useless. They needed a completely different, much more complex chemical process.
This is where they create what they called flotation coal.
For this fraction, the material went through a whole pre-treatment process. A hydraulic concentrator, stainless steel screens, a thickener, and finally, into a vessel called a conditioner.
And the conditioner is where the real chemistry happens.
It is. This is where they added 2 critical and surprisingly simple ingredients.
Which were?
Fuel oil and pine oil.
Okay, how did that work?
Well, the science is actually really elegant. Coal particles are oleophilic. They have an affinity for oil. Sand particles are not.
So the oil sticks to the coal.
Exactly. The fuel oil coated the tiny coal particles. Then they added the pine oil, which acts as a frothing agent. It creates all these tiny air bubbles.
And the source uses this wonderful folksy analogy to explain it.
It does. It says the oil-coated coal particles clung like Daisy May, while the stubborn, water-loving sand remained aloof like little Abner.
So the coal, now clinging to the oil, sticks to the air bubbles and floats to the surface as this thick black froth.
A black scum, basically.
Yeah.
And the final separation step was to pass this mixture through a series of Denver cells.
Which were described as being like an old-fashioned butter churn.
Like an old butter churn, yeah. These revolving paddles would gently scrape that floating coal scum off the top, finally separating it from the sand-laden water below.
It's an incredible process. You take polluted mud, you jiggle it, you treat it with pine oil, and you skim the foam off the top.
And the result was pure anthracite. But even then, the coal wasn't ready. It still had to be prepared for the specialized burners.
This is the final step, pulverization.
They take the cleaned coal, run it through a drying unit, and then feed it into these huge revolving bins. And inside these bins
was a literal railroad carload of heavy steel balls.
And the cascading force of those steel balls would crush the anthracite into a particle size so fine that the sources describe it as being as fine as face powder.
This fine black powder was the end product.
Right. It was then blown directly into the furnaces. The key was the pulverized coal furnace technology, which was more efficient and, crucially, allowed them to use those very finest silt sizes they got from the flotation process.
It's a complete closed loop. Industrial waste, cleaned with gold mining tech and chemistry, crushed into powder to fuel a city. And this whole system gave them the confidence to expand.
But By the 1950s, the river was fighting back in a different way. The primary fuel source, Lake Aldred behind the Holtwood Dam, was starting to run out.
It was becoming, as the engineer said, played out.
The best deposits were gone, and this happened right as demand was skyrocketing. Holtwood installed a huge new generator, unit number 17, in 1955.
And their fuel needs jumped from 180,000 tons a year to over 500,000. They needed more river coal fast.
So the solution was to move the whole operation upstream, about 10 miles north, to Lake Clark. This was the lake behind the Safe Harbor Dam, which was much newer.
Completed in 1931.
So its coal deposits were less mature, but they estimated there was enough there to last another 35 or 40 years.
And this wasn't just moving a dredge. This was a complete $6 million investment in a new state-of-the-art facility at Safe Harbor in 1953.
They were betting big on the future of river coal, and they designed the new plant to be far more efficient, aiming to produce 2,400 tons of clean coal every 24 hours.
Which required some serious new hardware.
Starting with the dredge itself, the 117 dredge. This thing was an absolute monster. A new 14-inch suction dredge, the largest piece of floating equipment on the Susquehanna above tidewater.
And it could operate down to 45 feet deep.
Giving them access to reserves the old dredges could never touch.
And the transport system scaled up too. They moved on from the old wooden waddlers.
They assembled 4 brand new 800-ton capacity steel barges right on site. A huge upgrade.
And getting that payload ashore at Safe Harbor was a whole new process.
They built this impressive steel-framed tower with a boom. A clamshell bucket would take 5-ton bites from the barges, but instead of dumping it in a bunker, it went into a hopper where it was mixed with water to create a slurry.
A thick liquid slurry.
And that slurry had to get to the washing plant, which was up on a bluff high above the river.
This is where the engineering commitment really shows.
They pumped that slurry through a massive 12-inch pipeline, and they actually built a tunnel for that pipeline that ran underneath the adjacent active railway lines.
Building a tunnel under active tracks, that's a sign of permanence.
It absolutely is. They were literally pumping a mountain of waste up to the washing machine on the shore.
And the cleaning process at Safe Harbor was designed not just for efficiency, but for something new, regulatory compliance.
That's the defining feature of the Safe Harbor plant. They were now dealing with the Pennsylvania Clean Streams Law, which was starting to prohibit returning pollutants to the river.
So they were still using the shaking tables in the flotation process with the pine oil.
Same principles, yes. But the crucial innovation was the waste management that was attached to it. Remember, you're cleaning 1 million tons of sludge every 9 months. You have to do something with 500,000 tons of contaminated sand and mud.
And if you can't dump it back in the river, where does it go?
It all went to a massive treatment facility called the clarifier, a huge concrete basin, 150 feet in diameter. The fines would settle out, and the thick, concentrated waste, the mud and sand, still had to go somewhere.
So they pumped it several miles away.
To a specialized refuse basin, which they created by damming a nearby valley.
Building a dam just to hold waste material, that shows the extreme cost of meeting even these early environmental regulations.
It was a massive effort. And they also recycled the water. The cleaner water from the top of the clarifier was cycled back into the plant for reuse.
And once the coal was clean, it had to be dewatered and shipped the 8 miles down to Holtwood by train.
This was a dedicated, complex logistical chain. They were shipping about 50 loaded hopper cars of clean coal a day, 6 days a week. It was the absolute lifeline for that new big unit at the Holtwood steam plant.
So by the mid-50s, PW&P had created this intricate, highly regulated system, a $25 million investment overall, to turn free river waste into power. It seemed like a secure future.
Unfortunately, that security was an illusion. Despite all the investment in compliance, the entire industry was rapidly running out of time.
Because of the swift increase in environmental regulation in the late 60s and early 70s.
Exactly. The National Environmental Policy Act of 1970, the stricter Pennsylvania Clean Waters Act of 1972. The requirements became so stringent that even the advanced safe harbor operation was ruled non-compliant.
And the violations were things they couldn't really fix. The dredge itself was damaging the river bottom.
Right. They objected to them screening coarse trash like logs and dumping it back in the water. Even the barges had overflow weirs that would let some fine slimes escape.
But the real death blow, the single most onerous new rule, was what?
The prohibition against returning any mud, sand, or detritus separated from the dredged coal back into the river.
And that just transforms the economics entirely. If half your material is sand and mud, and you can't put it back where you got it from, you have an intractable solid waste problem.
It's logistically impossible at that scale. The refuse basins were too small to handle that volume indefinitely. So, facing a losing battle, the safe harbor operations started cutting back in 1971.
But the final permanent blow didn't come from a regulator. It came from nature.
In June of 1972, Tropical Storm Agnes hit the region, catastrophic flooding. The sheer volume of mud and debris that washed into Lake Clark was unprecedented.
And it buried the coal.
It buried the coal under such a thick, dense layer of fresh mud that the 117 dredge, their newest, best piece of equipment, just couldn't work anymore. It clogged the intakes, it broke down, it was over.
The river, after nearly a century of being used as a waste chute, finally fought back and won.
Dredging ceased across the lower Susquehanna by the end of 1972. The safe harbor plant was shut down.
But Holtwood's big steam unit, Unit 17, still had to run. They had to get scrambled for a whole new plan.
And that plan was a massive and expensive reversal in logistics. They went from free river fuel to a costly road-based operation.
They started trucking it in.
Intense trucking operations. They had as many as 120 trucks per day bringing in silt coal and prepared anthracite from as far away as Schuylkill County. They even brought in petroleum coke, or pet coke, from Delaware.
Going from $3 a ton fuel to relying on 120 trucks a day must have destroyed their operating costs.
It did, which forced them to become masters of fuel blending to keep Unit 17 viable. They settled on a very specific mix, roughly 60% silt, 22% prepared anthracite, and a critical 18% of that pet coke.
And why only 18% of the pet coke?
Yeah.
The sources say it was the cheapest and had the highest heat value.
One fatal flaw: incredibly high sulfur content. Environmental regulations capped it rigidly at 18%. Without that cheap blended mix, Unit 17 would have been shut down much earlier.
And the other, older Holtwood steam units were already casualties of the new environmental era.
Yes, Units 15 and 16 were shut down in the mid-70s. Unit 17 remained the sole coal user, the last gasp of the coal era at Holtwood, all the way until 1999.
So after 45 years, what finally shut down that last unit?
Nitrogen oxide emissions, NOx. New rules required a massive reduction. The fix installing a huge catalytic converter system was deemed cost prohibitive. So in 1999, the unit was finally deactivated.
And with that, the strange, innovative, and profitable era of coal at Holtwood was definitively over.
The site reverted fully back to its original purpose, hydropower. And the innovation continued. In 2013, 2 massive new hydro units went online that use as much water as the previous 12 units combined. The site is now entirely clean and renewable.
It's a remarkable full-circle story. So what are the key takeaways from this unique industrial adaptation?
It's just a textbook case of technological lock-in and adaptive reuse. An industrial inefficiency creates a hazard, the fix for that hazard creates an environmental crisis, and new technology creates a profitable solution to that crisis.
Until regulations and a natural disaster make that solution too expensive.
Exactly. And the engineering was just mind-boggling. Borrowing from gold miners, using pine oil, operating a huge river fleet, building dams just for waste, all to keep the cheap fuel flowing.
And we should acknowledge, even though it was driven by profit, it did achieve some level of cleanup. By 1948, the Holtwood engineers were already saying the Susquehanna was considerably cleaner than it used to be.
They were, by accident, performing the largest environmental remediation project in the state.
So the industry ran for about a century. But this brings us to the massive, lingering question that connects back to the beginning: the scale of the original pollution.
The staggering figure, the 900 million tons.
Right. The experts estimated 900 million tons had accumulated in the waterways. If Holtwood recovered maybe 2 million tons and Safe Harbor pulled out maybe 10 million, even counting all the other operations,
you're still left with hundreds of millions of tons, the vast majority completely unaccounted for.
And this raises a really challenging question for you, the listener, to think about. What happened to all that fine coal silt? Did the 3 big dams, Holtwood, Safe Harbor, and Conowingo, manage to trap the overwhelming bulk of it forever, just changing the geology of the riverbed?
Or did the catastrophic floodwaters of Hurricane Agnes and other big storms act as a massive natural scour, picking up that enormous volume of fine, black material and pushing it further downstream?
Fundamentally altering the landscape and ecosystem of the lower river, and ultimately impacting the delicate environment of the Chesapeake Bay for generations to come.
That is the ultimate unsolved legacy of the hard coal Navy. They took a fraction of the waste to power a city for decades, but the environmental cost and the final location of the rest of that coal remains a mystery, settled deep beneath the waters. Something to think about.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Uncharted Lancaster podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to subscribe and leave a rating or review wherever you listen. It really helps more people discover the show. For more fascinating local history, visit unchartedlancaster.com. And if you'd like to go deeper, check out one of Adam Zern's books at unchartedlancaster.com/books. Until next time, keep exploring.